Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Lynn and today I am going to make a galaxy background mug that is monogrammed. And I'm going to start off the exact same way as I did with my previous galaxy sublimation project. This is some Liquitex masking fluid that I am splattering onto some lightweight cardstock. This is about, I think it's either 60 or 65 pound cardstock. And the reason why I'm using cardstock and not just regular text or copy paper is because I'm going to be applying a lot of ink onto this, and I am worried that with a lighter weight just copy paper, it's not going to hold the ink as well, and it's not going to blend as well. So I'm using a cardstock where I know it's a little bit easier to blend with regular inks, and I've done this once before with Artist Spree's iron-on inks, and it worked great. The thing that I mentioned in my previous video, because I used pouncers on that video, instead I'm going to use blending brushes, and I'll show you how that looks later. But right now what I want to do is actually figure out how long of a stretch of cardstock I'm going to need. So I just took a ribbon and really quickly wrapped the ribbon around the mug, and it came to about 10 inches, and my mug itself is 4 inches tall, but I'm going to make two mugs. This sheet of paper can make two mugs, but so I'm going to do the galaxy background at the same time for both. And what I have here is the monogram. I've die cut the monogram out of masking paper, and what I did was I die cut it, but with the cutting blade touching the back of the mask, the sticky side of the mask, so that when I adhere the letter onto my cardstock here, it's actually mirrored. And that's because when you do sublimation, what's going to happen is this is going to get wrapped onto my mug, and the design is actually going to be mirrored. So if you have anything that has a correct orientation from left to right, like letters and numbers, then you want to make sure that you mirror your design. And so all I've done is I gave myself some pencil marks so that I can kind of see where my mug, the strip that's going to wrap around my mug, where that will be. And that's just going to help me kind of figure out the scale, of my splotches. But otherwise, this is pretty much the same technique as what I used on the patches that I made earlier. I started with my brightest colors, in my case, yellow and pink, and I kept them pretty separate from one another so they're not touching, they're not overlapping, lots of white space in between. And then my two mid colors are purple and blue. And I just start to gradually fill in that white space with all of these layers of colors. And it still looks, I know, very splotchy. It looks like a hot mess, and it's gonna look that way really until after the project is all complete. Especially, and that's generally true with galaxy backgrounds, but it's particularly true with sublimation projects because colors don't look quite the same on the paper as they do after you've sublimated them onto your blank. So right now, for example, the black ink looks very brown. Doesn't look very dark at all. Some of the other colors look pretty bright, pretty saturated, but once you see the reveal of the mug, it looks very, very different, and everything looks a lot brighter and much more vivid. So all I'm aiming to do here is just continue to layer on colors so that I have a good contrast of light and dark. And as well, I want to make sure I'm overlapping the colors so that I don't see really specific areas where one color ends and another color begins. And then it looks like there are more colors than just the 5 that I'm using, because where the yellow overlaps with the blue, then I get some nice greens, and I get some purples and some different shades of purpley pinks, or purples that are more in the blue tones. So all of that is helped by just adding layers and layers of color, and just continuing to work at it, continuing to blend. Don't be afraid to go too dark. It is the Galaxy after all. So being generous with the black definitely helps, but I don't like just black by itself. I always layer the blues or the purples over and under the black, so that it's got a little bit more depth to it. It's got a little bit more kind of character to it. Now that all of my ink blending is done, I did give it a moment to dry, and then now I'm coming in with my gum eraser to rub off that masking fluid that we splattered on. And now the Galaxy is starting to look a little bit better. It still doesn't look so hot, but it's with the stars in there, it definitely helps it to look a little bit more like the night sky. And you want to be careful to get all of this off, because this is actually the whole thing is gonna get heat up, and that's how sublimation works. Is you need to apply heat in order for this ink to transfer onto your blank. And so you don't want any of that masking fluid to still be on here when you go to do your sublimation. Now, if I had to do it over again, I would have planned a little bit better, because the idea to monogram this came after I splattered already. But if you were to do this, I would put your monogrammed mask down first, because at this point I had the masking fluid under the letter, so I still have to rub that off. But I wanted to be really careful not to accidentally get any ink smudges in my monogram letter. So you can avoid that if you put your mask for the monogram down first, and then splatter your masking fluid on top second. And that way, once you peel that mask off, it's just clean cardstock underneath. Now I've cut down my 2 strips here to the height and to the length that I need. And so what worked out better, this first one I cut a little bit taller, but what worked out better was 10 inches long by 3 7/8 tall. And that's just what happened to work really well with this size mug. It's an 11-ounce mug. It's the Craft Express blanks. And what I'm going to do before I wrap is I just spritzed some alcohol onto this paper towel. It's a shop towel. And I wiped it down so that any oils, any, my fingerprint smudges, any dust, it's going to wipe all of that away, because you want it to be as clean as possible. Anything that might interfere with the ink transferring onto your blank is going to result in maybe some changes to your intended design. And so making sure that it's nice and clean is definitely an important step. Now, with wrapping this, the key is to really make sure that the paper, ultimately, that your design is making solid contact with the mug. Because what's going to happen during the sublimation process is heat is going to get applied to this. The artist-free iron-on inks are specially formulated for sublimation, and what happens when heat gets applied to it is that it goes from the solid state of the ink on the paper to a gaseous state, and when it cools down, it will return to a solid state. So what happens during the sublimation of a blank is that if this ink turns into a gaseous state and you have an air bubble or an air pocket where your design isn't making good contact with your blank, that gas is free to kind of float wherever it wants to float. And so it's going to create a more cloudy, ghosted image as opposed to a really crisp and sharp image. Because if your design is making really solid contact with the mug, when that ink turns into a gas, it has nowhere to go except into the mug. And that's what's going to happen, is that during the sublimation process, when heat gets applied to the ink, it goes from solid to gas. But when heat gets applied to your blank, which either needs to have a high enough polyester content or a polyester coating, like this mug, that polyester, it actually, those cells open up so that it can actually receive. And when everything starts to cool down, that ink has transferred into the polyester coated mug and becomes a permanent part of the mug. So what's really fabulous about doing sublimation projects like this is that it is going to result in a more durable mug over time, because it's not like adding a vinyl layer on top of it where you could peel that vinyl off over time. It could crack if it's a t-shirt, for example. But in this case, that ink is now a part of the mug. There's no extra layers of ink or anything on the surface of the mug. And so this is going to end up being very durable. You can put it in the dishwasher. You can, clean it. It won't fade. It won't rub off or anything. And so, as you saw, I did a lot of taping, especially along the outer edges of this mug, just to really make sure that I don't have any air gaps. Now, what I have here is some shrink film, and this is also from Craft Express. And the only thing is that it's bigger than what I need, which is fine. I made it work, but I think that if I had some shrink plastic that was, or shrink film that was closer in size or designed to go with my mug, it might have been better. But I'll show you how I worked with this. So I've just trimmed it down to 6 inches tall. My mug is 4 inches tall, so I've given myself an inch on both ends. Now at the seam of one end, I'm going to cut a slit so that my handle can poke through. And now I'm going to tape these open ends to my mug. And I'm also going to show you how I deal with the fact that this is so much bigger than what I actually need. So once I get this taped down, and the reason for this shrink film is that, recall I was saying, when during the sublimation process, if there's any gap between your design and your blank, when that ink turns into a gas, it can kind of float, wherever, and you might get sort of a ghosted image. You might get a more fuzzy image instead of nice, sharp, crisp design. Well, this shrink plastic is going to help add the pressure to really keep that cardstock nice and tightly fitted to the blank. And so you saw a moment ago, I just wrapped I overlapped the excess and I just wrapped it over, and I'm just going to use my heat gun to shrink this plastic. Now you want to be careful that you don't keep your heat gun in one place for too long, because it might actually melt and create a hole in your shrink film. But you also want to apply enough so that it is like tightly shrink wrapped to the mug, and that there aren't any air pockets, because this is actually applying some nice strong pressure against the cardstock Galaxy design, and it's holding it really tightly to the mug. And now comes the fun part of the sublimation. So I've got the Craft Express sublimation oven. This is their small one. It's super cute, nice and compact. I knew at the outset I was going to make 2 mugs, and this can fit that, but I'm gonna do one at a time just to experiment, make sure I have the settings right. And there's a single dial. It's really easy. You tap on the temperature to change the temperature. You just rotate the knob left or right. You tap on the little clock to change the timer setting. And again, you rotate left and right. There's long presses to start and stop at the bottom. You have that there. Now, originally I set this to 355 and 16 minutes, but I double checked the manual and I'm glad I did. It's actually 13 minutes at 355 Fahrenheit, and the oven will beep so that you know. So as it's warming up, it's hard to read it, but that red glow to the left, it says run. That's going to be blinking as it's coming up to temperature, and you'll get a couple of beeps and a few seconds to place your blank into the oven. And then the timer is going to automatically start to count down. And then when the time is up, it will beep again and flash, as you can see. So you definitely want to make sure you're using heat-proof gloves. These ones probably are good enough for holding it for like a short amount of time, but I wouldn't hold it for a really long period of time with these particular gloves. I would use maybe some heavier duty kind of oven mitt kind of gloves. But as it's coming out of the oven, the first thing I want to do is I want to take the shrink plastic off, because while it's warm, it's a lot easier to remove. It's still a little bit malleable. When it cools down again, it's going to be nice. It's going to be like super firm and a little bit harder to take off. But I'm not taking this off just yet. I actually let this cool, because as it's cooling, that ink is returning to a solid state. I don't want to start peeling this off and removing it too early, because if it hasn't cooled down enough to really, complete its transfer, you could disrupt your design a little bit. If it's still a little bit in that gaseous state, you could actually disrupt the design. So patience is the key here. Just let it cool down enough to where you can, it's just warm. I mean, this isn't completely cool to room temperature. It's still a little bit warm. That's why I still have a glove. But even if I touched it with my hand, it wouldn't have burned me. And so here's the reveal. Look how fabulous that is. And you can see on the left, there's still quite a lot of ink there that hasn't transferred, but you can see what has transferred over. Look how bright that is. Look how dark those blacks are. How vivid the colors are. It's really, really nice, and it worked really well. There's some aspects that I can improve on for next time. In particular, at the very top and bottom, there's some areas where the paper or the design didn't make really good contact, so there's a little bit of blurring. It looks a little bit pinched, you know. But all in all, I'm really happy, and I shared on Instagram and my socials my mug as well, because I did make two. Thanks so much for catching my video today. I hope you enjoyed this project, and until next time, happy crafting and have a fabulous day. Bye!